Welcome to the Crazy Alchemist podcast, where alchemy, occultism, and strange history come alive.
If you've read the Da Vinci Code or seen the movie, you know the controversy. One of the most famous paintings in Western art, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, has a figure in it who has puzzled viewers for 5 centuries. The figure is sitting to Jesus's right. Long hair, soft face, slim shoulders, no beard. Dan Brown's novel argued that this person is not who Christian tradition has always said it is, that it is, secretly, Mary Magdalene, the wife of Jesus, the mother of his bloodline, the real Holy Grail hidden in plain sight by an artist who knew the truth. The book sold 80 million copies. It convinced a generation of casual viewers that Leonardo had buried something in that painting the Vatican did not want them to see. The real story behind that figure is older than the novel and stranger, and almost nobody knows it. Let me describe what you are actually looking at. Leonardo painted the Last Supper between 1495 and 1498, on the back wall of the dining hall of a monastery called Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. He used an experimental paint mixture that allowed for fine detail, but turned out to be a disaster for preservation. Within 20 years of completion, the painting was already flaking. It has been restored, badly and well, more times than any other work of Western art. What you see today is largely a careful reconstruction of what Leonardo originally laid down. The scene is the moment from the Gospel of John when Jesus tells his 12 disciples that one of them will betray him. The disciples react, they lean toward each other, they argue, they protest their innocence. Jesus sits at the center, hands open, calm. The whole composition is a grammar lesson in shock, spreading outward from a still source. To Jesus's right, leaning slightly away from him, is the figure with the features that started the controversy. The face is smooth and youthful. The hair falls in long curls past the shoulders. The body is slim. The head is tilted gently toward the next disciple at the table, who is gripping the figure's shoulder and trying to ask a question. The Christian tradition has always identified this figure as one of the 12 apostles, a man named John. So the first question to ask is, who was John, and why does he look like that?
The Gospel of John, written probably at the end of the 1st century, tells the story of Jesus' last evening with his disciples. 13 men at a table. They eat the Passover meal. Jesus predicts the betrayal, and at one point in the conversation, the Gospel mentions a disciple who is leaning against Jesus' chest. The text does not name him. It calls him the disciple whom Jesus loved. That phrase appears 5 times in this one Gospel, always in moments of particular intimacy. He is the disciple who asks Jesus who the traitor will be. He is the disciple at the foot of the cross, to whom Jesus says, "Take care of my mother." He is the disciple who runs to the empty tomb on Easter morning and gets there first. He is the disciple who recognizes Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee after the resurrection. The Gospel never gives his name. Christian tradition, starting in the 2nd century, identifies him as John the Apostle, one of Jesus' original 12. There is a question hiding in here. The Gospel never says John was the youngest of the disciples. It never says he was clean-shaven. It never describes his face at all. So where does that image come from? The answer is partly logic and partly art history. The logic comes from the early church fathers. They knew from another gospel, the Gospel of Mark, that John had a brother named James, also a disciple of Jesus, also a son of a fisherman called Zebedee. The Gospels consistently put James first when the brothers are named together, which in ancient writing implies that James was the elder. By process of elimination, John was the younger. And the Gospel of John ends with a strange aside in chapter 21, where Jesus seems to suggest John might remain after the others have died. Early Christians took that to mean John lived a very long life, well into old age. If he outlived all the others by decades, he must have been a very young man at the Last Supper. The art history part is older than Christianity. In Greek and Roman art, the visual code for a youth was always the same: smooth chin, no beard, slim build, long hair worn looser than an adult man would wear it. Mature men had beards, young men did not. When Christian artists in the 3rd and 4th centuries started painting Bible scenes on the walls of Roman tombs, they were Roman artists trained in Roman conventions. They needed a way to show that John was younger than the rest, so they used the visual vocabulary they already had: beardless, smooth-faced, long-haired.
There was also a theological reason on top of this. Early Christian writers had decided that John was a virgin. He never married, he was celibate for life. In the moral framework of those theologians, virginity made a person closer to the angels, less anchored to ordinary adult masculinity. So painters leaned into the softness even further. And here is where we hit the first problem as modern viewers. The visual code for beautiful young man and the visual code for beautiful young woman overlapped almost entirely until the 1600s. A smooth face, a slim neck, flowing hair, wide eyes, these were the features of youth itself. Age and masculinity came as a package in the bearded, middle-aged face. Without the beard, without the age, the features read as androgynous to a modern eye. So, in a medieval painting, a figure with long hair and no beard could be John, or Mary, or the angel Gabriel. Context told you which. Leonardo did not invent the feminine John. He inherited him for more than 1,000 years of Christian art. But inheritance alone does not explain why this John is the way he is in the Last Supper. It does not explain why his eyes are nearly closed. It does not explain why his body is tilted toward Jesus the way it is. For that, we have to go to a convent in Germany in the 1300s. Around the year 1300, in the region between what is now southern Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, Christian sculptors started carving a specific kind of statue, one piece of oak or walnut, about life-size. It shows two figures, seated side by side, Jesus on the left in a long robe, and John on the right, leaning against Jesus' chest, eyes closed, cheek pressed against his master. One of Jesus' arms wraps around John's shoulders, the other holds John's hand. The sculpture has a name. It is called the Christ and John Group. About 28 examples survive in museums from Cleveland to Berlin to Antwerp. Most of them were made for a specific audience, Dominican nuns. In the 1300s, around Lake Constance in the Upper Rhine, there were about 70 Dominican women's convents. These were communities of women who had taken religious vows. They prayed, they sang, they worked, they read, and they meditated on images. A typical convent would have one of these Christ and John sculptures placed in a quiet chapel. A nun would come into the chapel, kneel in front of the sculpture, and gaze at it. She would imagine herself in John's place, resting on the chest of Christ, feeling the heartbeat, feeling the love. That was the whole point. The sculpture was a meditation tool, a way of imagining yourself, personally, held by God. Now, hold on. I want you to notice what just happened. A community of women took a scene from the New Testament, a scene in which one man leans on another man's chest, and they used it as a device for imagining physical, bodily, intimate closeness with a man who was also a god. They did this in the middle of medieval Christianity, and they did not get in trouble for it. In fact, their convents were sponsored by bishops. Their theology was endorsed by the Pope. Why? Because they were doing something with a long and established theological pedigree It was called bridal mysticism, and if you have never heard of it, do not feel bad. Most Christians alive today have never heard of it either, but for 1,000 years it was the mainstream Christian spiritual practice, and it is the single most important thing to understand if you want to know why John looks the way he looks. Let me explain what bridal mysticism is. Deep breath. Here is the idea, as simply as I can state it. In Christianity, and also in Judaism before it, there is a very old tradition of reading the relationship between God and the human soul as a kind of marriage. God is the husband, the soul is the wife. The soul longs for God, God longs for the soul. When they unite, in prayer, in contemplation, in ecstasy, that union is called mystical marriage. The tradition is old. It goes back to the Hebrew prophets, 600 years before Jesus. Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel all use the metaphor of God as Israel's husband and Israel as the sometimes faithful, sometimes unfaithful wife. The book of the Song of Songs, which sits in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament, is a love poem. On the surface, it is an erotic love poem, full of vivid physical longing between a woman and a man. Rabbis read it as an allegory. The woman is Israel, or the soul. The man is God. Christian monks inherited the reading. So far, this is polite mysticism, metaphor, allegory, nothing scandalous. But starting around the year 1100 in Christian Europe, something intensifies. A French monk named Bernard of Clairvaux begins preaching sermons on the Song of Songs. 86 sermons in total, delivered over nearly 20 years. Bernard refuses to keep the language abstract. He leans into the eroticism. He talks about the kiss of God, the embrace of God, the bed of union with God. He tells his monks to imagine themselves as the bride. All of them, male monks, imagining themselves as the female bride, pressed against the chest of the male beloved, who is Christ. Because Bernard was the most influential Christian of his century, his style spread. In the 13th and 14th centuries, women mystics picked it up and intensified it further. Mechtilde of Magdeburg, a German nun, wrote a book in which Christ comes to her as a lover and they fuse into one flesh. Hadewij, a mystic in what is now Belgium, wrote poems in which she hungers for Christ and is devoured by Christ. Later, in Spain, Teresa of Ávila, a Spanish nun in the 1500s, described a vision in which an angel pierced her heart with a golden spear, and she was left burning with the love of God. 100 years later, the Italian sculptor Gian Lorenzo Bernini carved that vision into marble for a chapel in Rome, in a church called Santa Maria della Vittoria. The statue shows Teresa reclining on a cloud, her robes in folds that seem to be moving of their own accord, her lips parted, her eyes rolled back. Above her stands the angel, smiling faintly, holding the golden arrow, about to strike again. Anyone who has stood in front of that sculpture has had the same thought. That does not look like a religious experience. That looks like something else. Here is the question you are probably asking. How is this allowed? The answer is that the official theology always had a safeguard. The safeguard was called allegory. Whatever these mystics wrote about, however physical it sounded, it was officially, theologically, not about human sex. It was about the soul's union with God. The soul, in Latin, is called anima. The word is grammatically feminine, so the soul, regardless of whether she lived in a man's body or a woman's body, was always called she, and her beloved, God, was always he. The grammar allowed a man to write erotic poetry to God without the church calling it heresy. He was writing as a soul, as the bride, not as a man. You can see what the nuns of Lake Constance were doing now. They were taking this whole tradition, 1,000 years old, and embodying it in a piece of carved wood. John, leaning on Christ's chest, was them.
The sculpture showed their own soul, resting where it wanted to rest. So John, in medieval art, is never only John. He is the model of the soul in love with God. That is why he looks the way he looks, soft, feminine, receptive, eyes closed, surrendered. The artists made him look like that on purpose. They were showing you what the loving soul looks like. And the soul is always feminine, even when she is in a male body. Now we can finally look at Leonardo.
Leonardo da Vinci was born near Florence in 1452. He was the illegitimate son of a notary and a servant girl. He trained in a painter's workshop in the 1460s. He was gay. He was charged with sodomy at the age of 24. The charge was dropped, but he never married, and his closest emotional attachments throughout his life were to beautiful young men. Leonardo also grew up in the center of a specific intellectual movement. Florence, in the 1470s and 1480s, was the headquarters of a Renaissance philosophical school called Neoplatonism. The name comes from the fact that they were trying to revive and Christianize the philosophy of Plato, the ancient Greek. The two main thinkers were Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. They taught, among many other things, that the human soul in its highest state is androgynous, male and female fused. They believed that the original Adam, before the creation of Eve, had been both sexes at once, and that Adam's perfection was in his androgyny. The separation of male and female was part of the fall. The goal of the philosophical life was to return to that original fusion. Leonardo breathed that air. You can see it in his drawings. His St. John the Baptist in the Louvre is openly androgynous. His late paintings are full of figures whose gender is hard to pin down. He was drawn to the image of the beautiful person who is both.
So when Leonardo sat down to paint The Last Supper in Milan in the 1490s, he was bringing everything together. He had the 1,000-year-old tradition of John as the soft, beardless, youthful, beloved disciple. He had the 200-year-old tradition of bridal mysticism, in which John represents the soul pressed against the chest of Christ. He had his own Florentine Neoplatonic interest in the androgynous ideal, and he had his personal sensibility as a man who loved young men. He painted John as the feminine soul pressed against the bridegroom. The figure looks the way it looks because the soul is feminine. That is the whole answer.
And here is the thing I want to emphasize. Leonardo was not doing something new. He was continuing a tradition. We have pre-Leonardo paintings of the Last Supper by Andrea del Castagno in the 1440s, by Domenico Ghirlandaio in the 1480s, by Cosimo Rosselli in the 1480s, by Pietro Perugino in the 1490s. Every single one of them shows John as beardless, soft-featured, sometimes with his head on Jesus's chest, eyes closed. Leonardo inherited the convention and pushed it further. That is all he did.
If John in Leonardo's Last Supper is secretly Mary Magdalene, then John in every other Last Supper of the previous century is also secretly Mary Magdalene, which would be very strange, because they are not. So how did we end up with the Mary Magdalene story? The short version is that somebody in 19th-century Paris took this ancient Christian imagery, fed it through an occult filter, and someone in the 20th century pulled it back out and called it history. Here is the 19th century part. Around the middle of the 1800s, a French occultist named Eliphas Lévi wrote thick books arguing that alchemy, the medieval art of trying to turn lead into gold, had never really been about metal. It had been a spiritual discipline in disguise. Its final product, called the Philosopher's Stone, was not a physical substance at all. It was a state of inner perfection. The symbol of that state was the androgyny, male and female united in one body. A generation later, in 1892, a French writer named Joséphin Péladan founded an organization in Paris called the Salon of the Rose and the Cross.
This was a yearly art exhibition and a mystical brotherhood combined. Péladan chose 3 patron figures for the 3 branches of his society. Leonardo da Vinci was one of them. He was declared the patron of one branch, alongside the medieval poet Dante and alongside a biblical figure named Joseph of Arimathea. From Péladan's point of view, this was not a joke. He genuinely believed Leonardo had been an initiate of a hidden wisdom tradition, and that he, Péladan, was bringing that tradition back. Péladan was not alone. There was a whole Paris occult scene in the 1890s obsessed with alchemy, with the image of the androgyne, with the idea of a secret spiritual lineage running through the Renaissance. What they did was take the Christian bridal mysticism tradition, which was always feminine-coded, and the alchemical androgyny tradition, which was hermaphrodite-coded, and the Neoplatonic ideal of the original double-sexed Adam, and they fused all 3 into a single mystical figure. Both sexes, both divine, both erotic and spiritual. They claimed Leonardo had been their secret ancestor. There is no evidence that Leonardo was an initiate of anything like this, but in the occult imagination of the 1890s, he was. Péladan wrote about it in published essays. Other occultists repeated the claim. It went into the cultural water of French esoteric circles and stayed there.
Now we get to the 20th century, in the man whose name you should know. In the 1950s and 1960s, in France, a man named Pierre Plantard sat down to invent a secret society that did not exist. He called it the Priory of Sion. He claimed it was a medieval order founded in 1199 in Jerusalem that had secretly preserved the bloodline of the Merovingian kings of France, who were themselves, secretly, descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. To make the claim look real, Plantard forged a series of historical documents and planted them in the French National Library in Paris. The documents included a list of so-called Grand Masters of the Priory through history. He copied much of that list directly from Péladan's Salon of the Rose and the Cross. Leonardo da Vinci was on it. Plantard added Isaac Newton and Victor Hugo to make it look more impressive. In the 1970s, 3 British authors found the planted documents in the library, took them at face value, and wrote a non-fiction bestseller called Holy Blood, Holy Grail. The book argued that the Priory of Sion was real, that the Merovingian bloodline of Jesus was real, and that Leonardo da Vinci had been the Grand Master of the Priory in the late 1400s, encoding the truth about Jesus' marriage into his paintings. In 1993, during a corruption investigation in France that had nothing to do with the Priory of Sion, a magistrate questioned Pierre Plantard under oath about his various claims. Plantard admitted everything. He had invented the Priory of Sion, he had forged the documents, the membership list was fiction. The whole thing was a hoax. That was in 1993. 10 years later, in 2003, an American novelist named Dan Brown read Holy Blood, Holy Grail and turned it into a thriller. He kept Plantard's claim that the figure to Jesus' right in Leonardo's Last Supper is Mary Magdalene. He kept the Priory of Sion. He kept the bloodline. None of it was true. Plantard had already confessed. Brown either did not check or did not care. The novel sold 80 million copies. So when the Da Vinci Code tells you that Leonardo's Last Supper contains a secret goddess-worshipping code, what it is actually tapping into is not a medieval conspiracy. It is tapping into a 19th-century French occultist fantasy about a medieval conspiracy, which was fabricated on top of a real and forgotten tradition of Christian mystical eroticism, which goes back to Bernard of Clairvaux in the 1100s, and further back to the Song of Songs, and further back to the Hebrew prophets. The real story is older than the novel, stranger than the novel, and almost completely lost. The novel trimmed down the strangeness to something a paperback reader could grasp. I want to close with the question that has been sitting under this whole episode. It is the question that interested me most when I started looking into all of this, and I think it is the question that matters. Why is the language of religious ecstasy in almost every tradition also the language of erotic love?
This is not only a medieval Christian thing. Look anywhere. Hindu devotional poetry describes the worshipper's relationship to the god Krishna in the vocabulary of a lover waiting for her beloved. Sufi mystics in the Islamic world, from Rumi in the 1200s onward, wrote poems that read like love poems, and scholars still argue about whether they are about God or about a human object of desire. Jewish mystics, in a book called the Zohar, turn the union of God with his feminine aspect into something explicitly sexual. The language keeps showing up, everywhere, across cultures that never spoke to each other. Modern psychology has taken a swing at this. The American philosopher William James, writing in 1902, suggested that religious experience and erotic experience share a common root in the nervous system. More recent researchers have gone further. Brain imaging studies show that deep states of mystical contemplation and sexual climax light up overlapping regions of the brain. People who report mystical experiences very often describe them in the language of erotic union because that is the closest vocabulary the body has. So maybe what medieval mystics were doing was not strange at all. Maybe they were describing an experience that the human body has always had the capacity to have, and they were using the only words that fit it. Which leaves you with an awkward inheritance. Modern Christianity has become quite prudish about sex, but its own central images, the soul pressed against the chest of Christ, the hearts pierced by the spear of divine love, the bridegroom coming in the night, were all once understood as love scenes. Every time you stand in front of Leonardo's Last Supper, every time you see a medieval sculpture of John reclining on Christ, every time you read Teresa of Ávila describing the golden spear, you are looking at what the tradition used to know, and then, for its own reasons, quietly forgot. The figure next to Jesus is John, who is the soul, who is feminine, who is surrendered, who is you, if you are willing. That is what the painting is saying. It is saying it in a visual language that was completely clear in 1498 and is almost unreadable 500 years later. Once you know how to read it, you cannot unread it. The painting stops being about conspiracies. It starts being about longing. Thank you for listening. The full article, with all the images we talked about, is on crazyalchemist.com. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe. There will be more.
If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to visit crazyalchemist.com for more intriguing content and follow Crazy Alchemist on Instagram and Facebook to stay connected.